Hello, this is Susie K. Edwards speaking to you from Palm Beach, Florida, and I want to tell you my story. So back in 2020, March of 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, sequestered at home alone in my townhouse in West Palm Beach, I began to stroll down memory lane, back to my childhood in the Virgin Islands. We moved to the Virgin Islands when I was only 6 years old because my grandfather, who'd been a partner in the Bugs and Meyer mob during Prohibition, saved his money and built the first luxury hotel on St. Thomas, the Virgin Isle Hotel. And when I was 6 years old, the whole family moved there with 3 poodles. And my grandfather and I sat in the lobby while my father was manager of the hotel. And it was a wonderful time. My brother and my cousin and I ran through the gardens and we caught lizards, and the boys proudly showed me how you could cut off their tails and they would grow back again. When I was a teenager, I went to boarding school in Massachusetts. It was a small private school called the Stockbridge School. Chevy Chase was the valedictorian of my graduating class, and I was the salutatorian. After high school, boarding school, I went to Cornell University briefly and hated it. It just wasn't for me. I'd been in a really small schools and in intimate settings, and I hated the big university. So I took the train back to New York City to my auntie's apartment. She was an artist as well. And I hung out there for a while until my parents became very concerned that I was doing nothing with my life. So they had friends in London, and this was in the early 60s, and the Beatles were just out. So their friends in London, it was a business partner of my father's, and he had kids my own age. So they sent me to London, which couldn't have been better for a girl like me. So I wandered around the city and found that I loved clothes, and I loved designing clothes. And I go to the Victoria and Albert Museum and look at all the old designs and go to thrift stores and start putting my outfits together. It so happened that a friend of the family's knew the head of the London College of Fashion, and I was interviewed and accepted, and I found my spot. That's what I wanted to do. It wasn't college, it was designing clothes. This was at a marvelous time in London. The school was right near Carnaby Street, and we would all go and hang out in the boutiques and put together creative outfits. At night, I went to the discos. The Ad Lib was happening then, and on any given night there'd be a couple of Beatles, a couple of Rolling Stones, whatever stars were in town from Hollywood. It was a wonderful, exciting time. So when I graduated from London College of Fashion, I went back to New York City and I beat the streets looking for work. Nobody wanted to hire me. I had no experience, so I ended up working as a sales girl in Bonwit Tellers, which was not what I wanted to do. But then the most amazing synchronicity of my life happened. When I was in London living with the Raw family, I went into the living room one Saturday afternoon and turned on the TV, and there was a show about fashion around the world, and it showed stuff in New York and London and Paris and in Tokyo. And the New York segment showed a young guy driving around in a sports car, and in the showroom there was music, rock and roll, lights. It was fabulous. It was just what I wanted to do. But I had no idea how I was going to be introduced to these people. But then when I went home to the Virgin Islands for Christmas, it turned out that my grandparents had a friend who was visiting them from New York. She was a blouse designer. She had a business for many years, and I told her about the television show, and she said, "Oh my God, I know those people. I almost married the father and the little guy, the guy in the sports car. I held him on my knee when he was a baby." I said, "Well, can you introduce me?" And she did. And it turned out the designer that they had, that was from Belgium, I think, couldn't get her working papers anymore, so they hired me. I was tremendously successful, so successful, in fact, that when Betsy Johnson left her company, Paraphernalia, that was the first boutique in New York, they offered me her job, but I was under contract. So I just had a great time and met all kinds of, the boss, the young guy in the sports car, knew all kinds of Hollywood people, rock stars, and that's where I met Brian Jones from the Rolling Stone, when he comes in later in the story. But anyway, so I met and married a lovely Englishman, and we were together for 3.5 years. But unfortunately, in the UK, he'd been a paratrooper in the British Army. So in New York, he really had no career and couldn't really make any money, and I was paying all the bills. So after 3.5 years, I said, I can't do it anymore, and we split, and I was heartbroken. He was heartbroken. He joined the American Army, and I decided I didn't want to stay in New York anymore. Meanwhile, Brian Jones from the Rolling Stones had introduced me to yoga through the book Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. So I decided to go to Woodstock. The Woodstock Festival had just been a couple of years earlier, so Woodstock was a happening place. I'd like to be in the happening places. So I went up there and began to study yoga, learned the tarot cards, studied astrology, and that was a very magical, mystical time living up in the mountains. I found out about a yoga teacher training, and there weren't many back in 1973, but I found about one on Paradise Island, Bahamas, and I went there, and I lived in a tent in the gardens for a month, and we all studied the Bhagavad Gita, the Vedas, and we did 4 hours of Hatha yoga every day, which is yoga exercises every day. We learned all the breathing exercises, and it was hard work, but it was a wonderful time. So when I left Paradise Island, I went back to Washington, D.C., where my family lived. My dad had been the finance chairman for George McGovern when he ran for president in 1972. So I was living with them, and I went to the Krishna temple with some friends, and I loved it there. It was magical. The walls were painted sky blue with extraordinary paintings, phenomenal smells wafted up from the kitchen of Indian cooking, from the kitchen in the basement of the building. And being the adventurous person that I am, I moved into the ashram. So I lived in the ashram for several years, and there I met my husband, Roy Edwards, who was an artist, and he was also a Krishna devotee. So we met and married, and I had 2 beautiful sons. We had 2 beautiful sons together. One now is a doctor, one now is a lawyer. But sadly, Roy died when he was only 53. So I moved along. I was not an unhappy widow. I continued with my studies of yoga and meditation, and found that meditation really saved me in my life. Every time that I would feel lonely, or I would feel blue, or I would feel upset or anxious, I would just sit and meditate, and I still do to this day. So I think being on a ship in the ocean is the most ideal place for meditation. It's the most ideal place for intuitive thoughts and dreams, psychic dreams. So I just love being on the ocean. I love being on ships, and I'd like to share this all with you. So I will read you some stories from my book. Thank you so much for listening. My book is called Quiet Mind, Crazy Heart, and you can get it on Amazon. It's my memoirs. With a lot of these stories and more, you will be entertained, and hopefully you will be inspired. Thank you.